So as Alejandro said, this is my first ever presentation, except, talking about UFOs with some coworkers at work and whatnot. So I want to thank all of you for coming to this today. And to follow Travis Walton is a little bit of pressure. So again, thank you, and we're in this together. So we'll get this started. My talk today is basically broken into two halves. In the first half, I'm going to be talking to you about basically a group or a handful of witnesses and experiencers that I've personally researched their stories and how we can sort of connect that to the study of ufology. I've always been very fascinated by characters. Like Alejandro mentioned, I am a playwright, and I love to know how people tick, how they react in certain situations, and ultimately how they change. And I found that very apparent in the UFO phenomenon as well. What is the aftermath of seeing a UFO or possibly having an encounter or an abduction experience? So we'll cover that in the first half. And the second half, I really want to get into what is ufology? Ever since the modern UFO era, we've attempted to study the phenomena, yet very few determinations have ever really come forward. So we'll look at just exactly how UFOs can be intrinsically linked to every realm of study in the most human of ways, and how at the very core of this phenomenon, it is those experiencing it that may matter most. So this is my talk today, UFOs versus ufology, the convergence of experience and study. So a little bit about me. I got involved with this subject at a very young age. I am not only interested in it, I believe I came face to face with it when I was 12 years old. This happened in 1995. I was on a summer getaway with my parents. I loved fishing, and I was fishing at night off of a dock, and I noticed three white lights in the reflection off the water. So I thought maybe it was a plane, so I look up, and this is basically what I saw. It was probably about 200 or so feet above me. There was a hazy red light in the center, and it just sort of coasted over the water, heading towards, this was the St. Lawrence River in central New York, which also borders Canada. And it was actually heading towards the Canadian border. Now, I did scream for my father to come out to see this thing. And there was a Yankees game on TV, so there wasn't... there was really nothing that was going to get him away from that, but I did. I got him to come out, and he did see the tail end of this thing as it drifted off. He told me it was a plane. I knew different, even at the age of 12. It was unlike anything I'd seen before, and it terrified me. It really did. That fear turned to an obsession, and I began to take out book after book from the Monday Branch Library in Syracuse, New York, where I'm originally from. And I started to interview people in my hometown about UFO reports and sightings that they had had. And one of the first people I came across was a Vietnam veteran who had worked on a command and communications vessel for the Navy, and he had a very dramatic UFO sighting over the water with 4 other Navy officers. They witnessed 7 orbs, orange in color, floating over the Pacific Ocean in a boomerang formation. Now, this guy had never spoken about this before, so I was very honored that I was the first that he was bringing it up to. But I was also 13 at the time, so what was I going to do with this information? Well, bring it to the only person and institution that I could think of. And that was Miss McCrone, my 7th grade English teacher. And John T. Roberts Middle School, which was my UFO reporting center, apparently. We had to write a report on something mysterious that we found of interest, so naturally, at this time, it was only UFOs for me. Eventually, my writing on the topic grew, and I started to branch out. I started interviewing people from not just my neighborhood, but all over the world. This would eventually lead to me writing for Open Minds magazine and, various other magazines as well, alternative magazines. And it really opened a lot of doors for me. And when I'd interview these people, there was something that really struck me. I noticed that when I'd interview them, I'd be scribbling little notes in the margins. I would put down the size of the craft. I would put down what time of day it was, how far up it was. But what really captured my passion was hearing how it affected them in the moment and after the event. And this eventually culminated into a project for me over 2 years, in fact. And I interviewed hundreds of individuals from all over the world. And I really focused on the aftermath of the experience and how the event changed them. This culminated into my first book, Somewhere in the Skies, A Human Approach to an Alien Phenomenon. So today I want to introduce you to a few of these individuals. We will see videos from them directly as well, and hear their stories and how their stories ultimately became my ufology. The first person I want to introduce you to is Damien John Knott. In the summer of 1988 in Sydney, Australia, at the age of 9, he witnessed a basketball-sized red sphere hovering above him outside. This sphere followed him all the way home, speeding up and slowing down as Damien sped up and slowed down. And he eventually made it home and told his mom about this. And she brushed it off to an overactive imagination. But then, 2 years later, he was camping with his stepbrothers, and the red sphere returned. All three witnessed this, and it seemed to have multiplied into several more lights, spinning all around one another and then disappearing. These spheres returned again and again, being recorded by both Damien and other people as well. This was caught on the news. This was caught by various MUFON investigators. And it eventually caught up to Damien. Whatever these spheres were, they seemed to be following him throughout his entire life. He would tell me that, quote, "I would spend hours at night anticipating their return. Many nights I wouldn't sleep. I lived in a constant state of fear mixed with wonderment and anxiety." Eventually, Damien decided not to reject these experiences, but to embrace them. He found others who had had similar sightings, and he no longer felt alone. And this would lead him to look into the UFO phenomenon up until today. So right now, I want to show you a video that Damien sent me and hear from him directly as he reflects on those events.
I knew at the time it wasn't anything normal. I'd never seen anything like it at the time. Even though I was a 9-year-old, you've already looked in the sky, you know what's up there. And this is something I'd never seen before, so it really affected me. But the sighting itself didn't just affect me. It was my mother's reaction straight away afterwards when I told her about it, and I was really excited. And she sort of it was a big letdown when she said, "Oh, it was just an aeroplane." But it was more. I knew that she was wrong. I knew what I'd seen, but the fact was, I kind of wanted to prove her wrong. So that's why I launched into a 28-year career of looking into the phenomena, basically in any way, shape, or form. Even in its relations, any relations to other paranormal phenomena, whatever they may be, ghost phenomena, poltergeist phenomena. There seems to be some certain interactions, or at least some sort of place where all these things seem to emanate from, and then go back to, due to a lot of their characteristics and my own experiences with them, and things that I've seen up close, which basically resemble UFOs in the sky, but things in your house that look the same. It could be paranormal, who really knows what it is. It could be semi-natural, paranatural. It's quite an incredible thing. And look, when you really think that you know the answer to this phenomena, you couldn't be further from the truth, because it's not as simple as, aliens coming from here, from certain planets. And I'm sure that, there may be things here already on Earth. This is why they're not travelling to and fro. But I think that a lot of this stuff may be interdimensional, extra, ultra-dimensional. I don't think we even really have a word for it. The initial thing for me was trying to basically prove my mother wrong. I know it sounds terrible, but that's what gave me the drive in a way. Not just the intrigue of seeing something amazing, but also the want to find out what it is, and the urge. It eats away at you, So I'd pick up every book I could, and I'd read, and I'd look at it, and I'd be, oh my God, wow, this is incredible. So other people are seeing this as well. But I came to realise that it was the stigma attached to the phenomena that ran all through society, and this is something that I saw as wrong, And I felt that stigma growing up myself when I'd speak about it, around strangers or whatever the case may be. But as a child, I'd ask strangers in the street, have you seen a UFO? Or, we'd be shopping and I'd ask random people. So it was quite, it was something that really affected me. And my sightings with my brothers, especially at the age of 12, after my initial sighting of this red sphere, that was of another red sphere, but also two other lights, which seemed to chase it around the sky, which is quite amazing. And it's affected all three of us as well. It's something that whenever we catch up, it's one of the first things that always comes up in conversation. So it's quite it's something that's profoundly affected me. Most of the things I read are about or look into is anything to do with paranormal phenomena, and UFO especially. But I find it all quite fascinating and possibly quite intrinsically linked.
Intrinsically linked, what really caught my attention. We often look at this phenomenon in a very singular way, that this is alien. But there are many different types of high strangeness in paranormal activity that Damien clearly feels are interconnected with this. And that's something that I really, really wanted to look further into, and I have with his sighting and many others as well. Now this next person I want to introduce you to also had a sighting. Like Damien, others had seen what Damien had seen. Other people did see what this next witness saw, but they did not remember it happening. This witness was the only one who remembered it. So this is Scott Santa. A little about Scott. He is a retired radioman, first class for the Coast Guard. He is also a retired Postal Service worker and a former MUFON field investigator. So this guy had experience in terms of analyzing things and making sense of them. But this event changed all that. It was the summer of 1974 in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. Scott was at a drive-in movie theater with a friend of his, and just before the movie started, Scott notices something above the movie screen. He asks his friend if he sees it too, and he says, quote, "Yeah, what the hell is that?" And this is what they saw. The object was pitch black, no distinguishing features. It was boomerang-shaped, and it was massive. Scott told me that from tip to tip, it covered the entire parking lot of the drive-in. It coasted over the parking lot, and all the lights in the venue went dead. People tried starting their cars, but nobody's engines would turn over. This is when Scott told me that, quote, "I could feel that something wasn't quite right." Go figure. The air was very heavy, and I could see and actually feel it shimmering. A few things really stuck out to Scott at this point. Everyone just stared at the thing, and they didn't react, almost like they were in some sort of trance-like state. The object disappears into a field, and the lights all turn back on in the venue. But the weirdest part of this entire event is that the movie starts, people get in their cars, and they start to watch like nothing had just happened. Even Scott, he brings his friend home with no recollection of what had just happened. It wasn't until many years later that he had a trigger event, which we will hear about in just a moment, that brought all of this to the surface. So yeah, let's hear from Scott.
I had my experience, became obsessed. You see all these books behind me. I have 6 other shelves throughout the room here, just loaded with books. The oddest thing that happened to me, of course, not only seeing this huge object, but was the feeling that was really hard to put into words, of what I have since learned was called the Oz effect when it was over top of the field where we were. And the second part that was really tough in retrospect was how utterly cut off everybody was after the object disappeared. It was as if we were turned off and you people go back and be normal and do what you were doing, okay? And so it was kind of like a black hole after that for me. I don't remember quite leaving. Obviously took my friend, went home, dropped him off. I have no recollection of that. And so it's really foggy for maybe a year or two after that. And what sparked my interest in it, or not interest, but what made it come out again was my running into the Rappelt book on UFOs. And as soon as I saw that book in a bookstore, the gates opened, and I have been forever changed. I was never in fear. I was more in awe during the experience. And I've wondered often what it was. If Ryan asked me to say what I thought it might have been, I still couldn't tell you. It was so big, so slow, so dark, that it's just indescribable unless you're there. And I watched it too, I watched it until it disappeared over the horizon, so I had it in sight for a good 15 minutes, at least. At least that's what I think.
At least that's what I think. That definitely struck me. Was this some sort of missing time experience? Had everyone at the drive-in theater had some sort of instant amnesia? And what about the strange electronic interference? The cars not starting, the lights in the venue going off. This all culminated into a very deeply strange event. And Scott struggles with that up until today, especially since he's the only witness to come forward about this event. He continues to search for others, including his friend that was there that night, to no avail. So what that must do to him, the pressure on him, being the only one to tell this story, I can't even imagine, to be completely honest. And while it seemed to almost control the emotions that everyone was feeling, I don't know what that is. What type of object, that big, that massive, it clearly wanted to be seen. It clearly wanted to evoke some sort of reaction out of those seeing it. But again, it also seemed to be in control of those emotions. This case is fascinating. It's one I continue to look into. I continue to work with Scott on, especially trying to find other witnesses to this. But I believe him. He is one of the most sincere individuals I've ever met. He has no reason to make this up. And like I said, he was a MUFON field investigator. So, yeah. Our next case that I want to cover brings us to Alberta, Canada. And this is on the other side of the spectrum. We're going to move into the experiencer topic for right now. And I just want to warn you, this is a very tough case because it did involve a child. This is Claudette Huber. Some of you might be familiar with Claudette. I first met her right here at this conference in 2013, her and her husband. And she was the first experiencer that I'd ever met face to face. And we met right over in the casino, in the diner, and she told me about her story. And I watched as she cried and held her husband's hand, and her knee was hitting the bottom of the table so furiously, and all of these things. These were the things that I would use to scribble into my notebook, the reaction when recalling an event in your life so traumatic. So this case really hit me to the core. This happened in 1977. Claudette remembers falling asleep next to her sister, whom she shared a bed with. It was a big family, small house. So she drifts off, but suddenly wakes up, feeling something very cold on her shoulder blades. She can't move anything except her eyes. She searches for her sister to no avail. Her eyes shoot down and she notices that she's naked. And on some sort of metal table, there's a bright white light shining down on her. She can then feel that there's a presence in the room. Her eyes dart to the right and she locks eyes with something. Its eyes are pitch black. She then notices it's not only one pair of eyes. And she found herself surrounded by 6 figures. Claudette screamed in terror. But whatever these things were, they seemed unfazed. They continued to stare at her. She described them as, quote, short. Their skin was black. It was wrinkled and flapped over, almost like a dog. They wore flowing robes and hoods over their heads. She then felt a slight pressure on her arm, and when she looked down, she saw the fingers of one of these beings wrapped around her wrist. Then everything went black. Claudette awoke the next morning, having slept later than she'd ever slept before, and she went downstairs and told her mother what had happened. And again, just like Damien, she was told that this was nothing but a dream, and that it was her imagination. And coming from a strict Catholic family, the mother said that this, whatever this was, it was evil, and she should deny it and ignore it. But she could not. This happened. She knew it happened, and that weighed heavy on her. She didn't talk about it for many, many years. However, she did have a few trigger events that really solidified this event to her. One of those was a book by Kim Carlsberg, and the image you see there is blue. The other image comes from a movie I'm sure we're all familiar with, about Whitley Strieber's events in communion. Claudette will talk a little bit more about these triggering events as well. So right now I want to show you Claudette's reflections on just exactly what she believed happened to her and where she stands on it today.
Of course, the typical ramifications of something like that. Oddly enough, for the longest time, and still today, I prefer to sleep in a completely black room, darkened. I feel safe if I can't see, if that makes any sense. Wrap my feet in my blanket so that I just, for some reason, was scared of having my feet grabbed. Can't explain why. And for a long time, I would sleep cocooned in my blankets. I had a method of putting the pillow over my face, my blanket cupped around my face with just enough of a hole that I could get fresh air in and out. And that was about the only way I felt safe to sleep at night with my door locked in my bedroom. Needless to say, there were times when I woke up, my door was unlocked, and all kinds of stuff. My jammies were backwards, or, you name it, I've had it. I didn't really start to try to understand what had happened to me because I had no way to even start finding out what had happened to me. To define it, there was nothing for me to go to. So, as an adult, reaching the age of 36, I hit a point when my son was born, and it was kind of a turning point because I hadn't expected to have another child that late in life, and so my life really slowed down in a sense that I didn't have a driving career distracting me. And I just decided that this was a kind of a weird hole that never was very explained. And so I started researching and trying to understand what had happened to me and the ramifications. That's how I feel, is just the search. Kim Carlsberg, definitely, her book played a huge part in my healing process, my validation process. It was advertised on the internet when I found her book, and this guy right here was the very first time I had any validation that, yes, I seen it, their fingers touched me, and this was like a big whammy. Migraine set in. It took me a long time to just process the fact that absolutely 100% I was not making up a dream, that this was for real. Also, your healing, I find, is very, I can't think of the term. It's not a consecutive, like step one, step two, and it flows in a nice, timely fashion. I find our healing process is very, I'm looking for the word, sporadic, and often you don't see it coming, and it's there, and another piece of the puzzle shows up, and it's always just kind of earth-shattering again. It shakes you, it takes you right back to the moment, those feelings, and you just are once again shaken because of the reality. And what does that mean, the reality? The reality to me is that who has the authority to encroach on a child's safety when they are at home under the care of their parents, safely tucked in bed? How have they circumvented all of this without any ramifications? They continue to do it. How have they become more superior to us that they are able to do this and play with us and play with our emotions? That's what I really struggle with. I struggle with the fact that there are those who possibly have the answers to this and allow people like me to be victims. Children that are coming into this world will be victims. I just don't understand that. I don't understand for what greater good. I guess we're collateral damage. But I'm very resentful. And I will always be searching. I'll always be questioning. I don't really accept answers that are given by those in authority or teachers or scholars until I have satisfied my own self because of my experience. I don't care how many titles you have after your name, because I know what happened to me. And therefore, there's a lot of very strange things out there that are unexplained.
So what struck me most about Claudette's reaction to her experience is that resentment. We hear this oftentimes with whatever this presence might be that's visiting people and or taking them against their will, that they lack some sort of empathy or ethics in a way. So that resentment is completely justifiable in my opinion. But sometimes it's not like that, and people find their experience extremely beneficial. And that was the case for the next person I want to talk to you about, and that is Michael Carter. Michael hails from my neck of the woods in New York City, and this event happened to him on December 28th, 1989. Michael remembers waking up in bed and looking over at his girlfriend, who was fast asleep, and he noticed a bluish-white light that enveloped the entire bedroom. He debated waking his girlfriend up, but he'd never seen her this fast asleep before. Then he saw something at the end of the bed that left him completely petrified, and he recalled the following. Quote, "Standing there was this being. It had an egg-shaped head and wraparound eyes, deep, black. It was very short, its head just peeking over the end of the bed. It was dressed in a silver, tight-fitting suit with a tunic collar. Its skin was a chalk white color, and it glowed brightly. It stared straight at me for what seemed like an eternity," end quote. Now, Michael was a pretty tough dude. He lived in the roughest parts of New York City for most of his life. But in that moment of seeing this tiny being at the foot of his bed, his immediate reaction was to pull the covers over his head and cower like a child. Those are his words, by the way. He remembers the temperature in the room dropping rapidly. He told me that, quote, "For a moment, I felt as though I had somehow been transported outside." So with all the courage he could muster, he finally ripped the covers off, and the being was gone. The room returned to normal. So Michael eventually forces himself back to sleep, thinking this was some sort of crazy dream. But then it happened again and again. For the span of almost 6 months, Michael was visited by this chalk-colored being who brought more friends each time. And every time, Michael remembers that they were trying to communicate with him somehow. One of my favorite parts about this story comes when he finds a book in a bookstore in Soho, in New York City, about alien abductions. And he was excited. He thought maybe this would be some sort of validation or give him some sort of answers. But as he's going up to make the purchase with the cashier, he becomes very timid. And he tells me that, quote, "I felt like a teenager buying condoms. I couldn't even look the cashier in the eye. I just wanted to buy the damn book and get out of there. And who could blame him? But the crazy part is that the cashier also claimed to have been an experiencer. So Michael and he struck up a conversation and would eventually start going to support group meetings with one another. Now here's where Michael's story really picks up. He was a practicing Christian prior to this initial experience, and it weighed heavy after the reoccurring experiences. He told me that, quote, I was wrestling with how Christianity and my experiences would fit into my worldview. During one of my experiences, I was shown a picture of a pair of hands in the prayer position with a lightning bolt going through it. I took this as encouragement to pursue energy healing and prayer. Michael eventually used prayer to help many people when he decided to join this seminary. He told me that, quote, I wanted to continue searching for meaning in the other realm of what I considered extraterrestrial, intervention, in tandem with my own spiritual journey. He would write his Master of Divinity thesis on the connection between UFOs and the Bible, eventually publishing these into book form. Many years later, he moved to North Carolina and became the minister of a Unitarian congregation. Now, these experiences had clearly altered the path of Michael's life, both in the physical and the spiritual. So let's hear from Michael as he reflects.
About that initial experience on December 28, 1989, it changed my life. I mean, it's up there with the birth of my daughter. And it changed, obviously, it changed the way I looked at religion, because I figured if these beings were seeing me, were visiting me in 1989, they were probably here in 1989 BCE, and even prior to that. I've written those books about, 2 books on UFOs and religion. I'm thinking outside of the box, actually, no longer thinking of the creator or a creator or God in an anthropomorphic sense, but I didn't really anyway. However, what I did realize is that there's more mystery in this universe. I'm not certain of the answers, and I never really was, but this affirmed it. Obviously, we're not alone. But for me personally, I took a break for about a year or two from really dealing with anything around UFOs. Of course, one has to live life, pay bills, and all those sorts of things. But I realized that my contacts, which were frequent at one time, and I'm sure will be again, were not the entire journey, but they were part of the journey. They were part of the spiritual journey. And for a while, I was just focused on that to the extent that I just was not participating fully in my life like I wanted to. Fascinating, wonderful experiences that they were, but they were part of the journey and not the journey itself. So that's about all I can say for it. I've integrated those experiences in my life, especially a lot of therapy and a lot of doing what you're doing, talking to people, thinking about things, feeling my emotions, those types of things.
So yeah, again, like I said, this clearly altered Michael's life, but he is the first to admit that although these things happened and are reoccurring and may happen again, he told me, you gotta live your life, man. Like, life goes on. There's more to it. And in tandem with this possible extraterrestrial presence and his faith, he was able to build upon that and become almost more human than he's ever been before. So again, very exciting story on Michael's behalf, no matter what might have visited him. So this is the last case that I personally investigated that I want to bring to you. And this is someone you might be familiar with. This is Chase Kletzky. She is was a MUFON STAR Team field investigator. She was formerly employed by such agencies as the Department of Defense and Homeland Security. She was also a certified private investigator. And like I said, she was also the STAR team manager for rapid response cases with MUFON, where they were sent out as an event was happening or had just occurred. So on April 20th, 2010, she was assigned to a case in Tennessee where multiple witnesses had reported seeing clusters of red and white lights in the sky over their homes. Most of the activity, however, came from a primary witness who would eventually contact Chase in a panic. He told her he'd seen a triangular formation of lights the night prior, and the next morning, helicopters were circling his land, appearing to be searching for something. Chase and her STAR team partner packed their bags and they went to investigate. There were brief introductions with the primary witness, and it was dark at this point, and immediately Chase noticed lights over a cornfield in the distance. The witness brought her and her partner out to the field to get a better look. They set up their equipment and noticed that the triangular formation the witness had seen had returned. It was actually heading right towards them. She noticed a red light in the center and noted that it was indeed a solid craft. They tried to take photos and video, but all of their equipment had gone dead. Convenient, yeah. The craft flew overhead and disappeared out of sight. Immediately, Chase felt some sort of imposing threat, like they were being watched. With just a glance, all three of the witnesses started to leave the field. They picked up pace, and then all of a sudden, Chase slams into the back of the primary witness. He just yells, "What the bleep is that?" He clearly didn't say bleep, but we will keep this PG. And this is what they saw. The being was about 3 feet tall, large head, and black eyes. It's staring right at them at this point. This only happened for a moment, and immediately they dart for their truck, get in, and speed out of the cornfield as fast as they can. They get back to the witness's home and assure one another that they'd all just seen this being in the cornfield. So this event, this happened in real time, and Chase was the first to admit to me that you don't get all of these things in one go. You have a UFO sighting, you have a close encounter with a triangular craft, and then you see a frickin' being in the middle of a cornfield. So this is where she believed that this event seemed somehow planned. What that means, she's still trying to figure out, and she struggles with that. Again, she felt this immediate threat when they were in the cornfield, almost as if their emotions were, again, being controlled by whatever was out there. So yeah, let's hear from Chase.
Honestly, at that point when we were running, I wasn't thinking of anything. I don't remember thinking anything. It was a little later, I remember realizing how fast I was running, and I couldn't believe how fast. It was incredibly fast. The problem is I don't know if I was thinking of that during the event or that came after. I just, that whole area from the minute I felt like someone was watching us until sometime before we pulled into the witness's driveway, this went away. I don't know when. Absolutely, I still go through it 1,000 times a year, 1,000 times. The other thing that really stays with me is why it was there. Was that being the reason we were controlled out of that cornfield. We weren't supposed to be there. That much I know. But was it the being? Was it the triangle? What was he doing there? Was he trying to warn us? Was he responsible for the terror? All these questions, again, are raised by that experience. And there's a part of me that can handle any of it. I can handle any of it except one scenario. And as an investigator, I've continued to, just learn and dive in. And the more witnesses you have, the more information we get, because we all know that nuts and bolts are awesome, but they're nothing without a witness statement. They're nothing without our experiencers and contactees. So I just learned this stuff, and as I'm taking all this in and applying it to my experience, I realize, oh my gosh, one aspect is there's a claim that these entities, these beings, can transfer their feelings, can transfer their thoughts to you. And all of a sudden it hit me one day, not immediately, this was quite a while after, oh my gosh, what if we were feeling what he was feeling in that cornfield and we left him? It's brutal. It's brutal. So it's the only one it's the only scenario I can't deal with. I can deal with anything else other than that. If he was reaching out for help, I can't even still talk about that. But the other, part of this experience that I still struggle with is being an investigator and a witness. Every time this event comes up again, I immediately jump into investigator mode. I'm not sure I've processed any of this as an individual. I literally still think about physical evidence and what was going on. Although for 3 weeks after that event, we had no less than 8 other investigators on site taking testimony from all of us individually. A lot of work was being done, and I still go in investigator mode. I'm still thinking of what did we miss? Is there still a question? But I can tell you I have not processed this personally. I kind of don't allow myself to, and every once in a while, it's when I'm talking to people, the hundreds of people that have shared their story, that they know exactly what that terror feels like, or they know exactly, some of the things happen to them, that they relate in my experience. It's just remarkable. It is just remarkable. And I find it only in those times when we're sharing that I start processing and I get a little more clue, much like entities can make you feel how they do. It's about the sharing, and it's so important. And honestly, the last thing that I really want to say about this is this community has been so kind to me. The experiencers and contactees and people I talk to, they're so amazing. They are so amazing and kind of hold my hand through a process, if that makes sense. But every once in a while, you hit that person. And I'll never forget the one day that another investigator came up and, very arrogantly, she says, Chase, you blew it. You ran away from your only chance to contact an extraterrestrial. If that was me, I would have stayed and made contact. And of course, the blinders went down immediately, and I thought, that's a pretty bold statement to know what you would do in a situation. And I was more dismayed that this investigator absolutely missed some of the most important parts of the testimony of my experience. When I came forward and told the truth from A to Z, she missed some big things. So of course she thinks she can stay and try and make contact with the being. You know, she missed the whole control thing or the hive mind, or, you know, that whole part seemed to not have mattered. And I only bring that up for this reason. We ask people to come forward and tell their stories, and this is why this event has made me so much more compassionate, so much more respectful, and absolutely a better investigator, because I don't go in with judgments. I don't think about what I would do in that situation. We weren't there. And truthfully, I think the more we ask our witnesses to come forward, we need to protect them better. They don't need judgment. They don't need armchair conclusions. They deserve respect, and they deserve our support. And more importantly, they deserve compassion. And when I say that, compassion is not because they're a victim. The compassion is because I can almost put money on, if you've had any experience, even as quick as mine was 1/1002. That's the amount of time I had with my being. It changed my life. It changed my life.
So these were just a few of the stories that I have for you today. And what I want you guys to sort of take from this is that the experiencer and the witness plays a very pivotal role in ufology. Again, we have dates, we have times, we have size of craft, we have all this, but the people are what matter most, in my opinion. And to sort of piggyback off that, on this second half, which I will sort of breeze through, this actually, time is flying, is what is ufology? Loosely defined as the study of reports, visual records, physical evidence, and other phenomena related to unidentified flying objects. That is as self-explanatory as you can get. But we know that there is more to it than that. So I sort of want to go through the many faces of ufology and how these can be implemented, no matter what kind of study you use, into what we have termed ufology. So first I want to cover astronomy, which you will be hearing in depth about from Stanton Friedman later this week. So one of the people who I wanted to bring up is Clyde Tombaugh. Tombaugh was the American astronomer who discovered the now demoted planet of Pluto. On August 20th, 1949, he observed a UFO that appeared as a geometrically arranged group of 6 to 8 rectangles of light, window-like in appearance and yellowish-green in color, which moved from northwest to southeast over Las Cruces, New Mexico. He stated that, quote, "I doubt that the phenomenon was any terrestrial reflection, because nothing of that kind has ever appeared before or since. I was so unprepared for such a strange sight that I was really petrified with astonishment. I have seen 3 objects in the last 7 years which defied any explanation of known phenomenon. I think that several reputable scientists are being unscientific in refusing to entertain the possibility of extraterrestrial origin and nature." The next study I want to bring up is chemistry. And this comes to us from Dr. Errol Farouk. He was a synthetic organic chemist who's worked for many reputable pharmaceutical companies. And he has written for the Journal of Antibiotics, the list goes on. And while all this is impressive, it was his involvement in the 1971 Delphos, Kansas case that caught my attention. This case involved a young man named Ron Johnson who witnessed a mushroom-shaped object hovering about 70 feet above his parents' farmland. The object began to descend until it was only a few feet off the ground. Johnson moved towards it, but was soon blinded by the object's multicolored lights. Johnson called for his parents, and all three witnessed the object shoot upward and disappear. They noticed a glowing scorched ring on the ground below where the object had been hovering. So Dr. Farouk's involvement with this was he wanted to study the physical trace evidence left behind. So he requested samples of the soil within and around the scorched ring. He was granted samples from the area and used his own equipment and skills and money, which these things often come down to analyze it. And what he discovered was pretty fascinating. The compounds of the soil, when put in water, could be dissolved, yet they also acted as a repellent against the water. Even more intriguing, however, was that whatever caused the ring in the soil appeared to emit light. So it was clear that chemistry had found its way into ufology, and vice versa. Dr. Farouk only solidified this with his final words to me. Quote, "Since the main obstacle to scientific acceptance of UFOs is in demonstrating that an actual physical phenomenon is involved, then I believe that the Delphos case analysis establishes that reality, in the sense that it strongly implicates a non-earthly luminescence technology having left its mark in the soil." Travis Walton briefly spoke about Michio Kaku, which I will do as well. He's been pretty vocal on UFOs when theorizing the ways in which UFOs have been traveling to Earth, or could travel to Earth, given that some may indeed originate from off-planet. He deconstructs the fallacy that these possible alien craft are indeed not piloted, by a living being. He says, quote, "Can UFO characteristics be explained using modern science? In movies, it's always assumed that alien beings pilot these craft. More likely, however, if such craft exists, they are unmanned. This would explain how the craft could execute patterns generating G-forces that would normally crush a living being." I found this really interesting. We live in an age of drones where we use this technology to monitor things, to do jobs that we do not want to do. We have unmanned missions to Mars. So I found this extremely interesting in terms of what Michio had to say. I want to touch on religion for a moment, theology in specific. First, we'll look at Judaism, the Song of Deborah, to be exact. The passage in the Torah is said to date back as early as the 12th century BC, and is perhaps the earliest sample of Hebrew poetry. In this passage, it states, quote, "Curse you, Meroz, said the messenger of the Lord. Curse you bitterly, you inhabitants thereof, because they came not to the aid of the Lord against the mighty." So according to many theologians and scholars of the Torah, it's been said that Meroz, spoken of in this passage above, is actually the name of a far-off star. The passage also refers to the inhabitants of Meroz. Therefore, this, among many other stars throughout the universe, could very well be inhabited by other civilizations. We'll also briefly look at Islam, and through the words of Dr. Shabir Ali, the president of the Islamic Information and Dawah Center International in Toronto. Now, Dr. Ali says many things that the Quran says it is very possible that there is life elsewhere, and that this is okay by the doctrine of the Quran. He also states that, quote, "God does not leave his creatures without guidance. It is possible that God's revelations to his prophets are sort of a mental communication. In that case, we do not need a specific language in which that communication needs to take place. It is one of the mind and one to speaking with one another through the mind. The mind of God could speak to intelligent beings in many different ways throughout the universe. And then we have Christianity. One of my favorite moments is when I asked my Catholic priest at confession what we were to believe about alien life. And he said to me that God, in the lens of Christianity and its messengers, absolutely promote the concept of life elsewhere. Because as he put it, it shows how powerful God is in his creation of both the heavens and the earth, and all that rejoice in his glory. We also will look at Ray Bosch, who is a reverend and was also a MUFON field investigator. And he says that, quote, "As a Christian, I view the cosmos as the creation of an eternally self-existent, transcendent, and immanent God. Therefore, by design of the Creator, the universe is an ordered system operating under repeatable, discoverable laws. Thus, we may hope to determine whether there is a known cause for an event, or whether there may be aspects to an event which simply cannot resolve within the present boundaries of knowledge. In the case of UFOs, for instance, we may discover a misidentification of natural phenomena, or we may perhaps discover evidence suggestive of some form of extraterrestrial life." We'll briefly touch on psychology. One of the most interesting quotes comes from Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and he said that, quote, "I'm puzzled to death about these phenomena, because I haven't been able to yet to make a determination with sufficient certainty whether the whole thing is a rumor, or if it is a hallucination or a downright fact." So in an attempt to analyze the idea of UFOs, Jung came up with a very controversial theory. To him, UFOs and their possible occupants were projections of our unconscious desire. He also says that this is possibly also connected to post-war anxiety of such. We will move on to someone who we're all familiar with, and that is John Mack. John Mack said that, quote, "The phenomenon stretches us, or it asks us to stretch to an open to realities that are not simply the literal physical world, but to extend to the possibility that there are other unseen realities from which our consciousness, our, if you will, learning process over the past several hundred years have closed us off." Now, this idea of consciousness I found very intriguing. And this is something you're going to hear about later this week from Greg Bishop. So I highly suggest checking out his talk. I want to move to philosophy briefly. In 2010, Stephen Hawking declared a moratorium on philosophy, stating that, quote, "Philosophy is dead. Philosophers have not kept up with modern developments in science. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge." So I personally take issue with that. Philosophy is an ever-expanding process of study, just like science. And within the theorizing of philosophy, I want to take a look at how we can justify the relevance of philosophy within ufology. I spoke with educator M.J. Benias, who has a background in critical theory, history, and cultural studies. He said that, quote, "UFOs are much like the mind-body problem. They are a thought experiment. They are an activity of the mind, a mental exercise in logic, rationality, and reasoning. While science cannot prove the self exists within the body and is unable to locate the seat of consciousness, scientists generally agree it is there. The agreement that the self exists rests upon personal experience. Science may one day find the physical location of where the self resides in the brain, if it exists at all. There is nothing to say that science may not one day be able to objectively prove UFOs are more than prosaic events either. However, until that day, both the self and UFOs will remain philosophical concepts and not scientific ones. If this is the case, then ufology is philosophy. The last thing I want to touch on is sociology. A good example of this comes from a term coined by author David Clark called the UFO syndrome. This is his way of looking at certain waves of UFO flaps throughout history. While one argues that people are seeing the same UFOs in a condensed area, Clark believes this is to be an influence of sorts on the perception of what one may have experienced in terms of the UFO experience. And we can take, for example, the modern UFO era of Kenneth Arnold, excuse me. And what was very interesting about this case is that Kenneth Arnold witnessed these objects and said that they appeared like saucers skipping off of water. And we all know at this point that what Kenneth Arnold saw was not saucer-shaped. But that is what everyone reported thereafter, having seen flying saucers all over the world. So this is fascinating. It's an exploration and one we need to look at further on a societal level. When it comes down to it, the witness themselves also play a large role in the social intelligence, as we saw in the first half of the presentation. Ufology itself, as we saw, the mainstream perception is that unintelligent individuals in small towns in the middle of nowhere are the ones having these sightings. Yet we know this to be completely false. I've shown you the wide variety of those experiencing UFOs and their possible occupants or controllers. Ufology doesn't need to rest on the shoulders of scientists, theologians, philosophers, or sociologists. It can rest on the observer and the complicated yet fascinating stories they bring forward. So this is my ufology. The hundreds of people I interviewed, more narrowly, the dozen or so I have in my book, and the countless more that I will meet this week. And I just want to add in closing that to those who strive for disclosure, those you heard from today and many others throughout this week have already had their own disclosures. So I urge you this week to meet a stranger and listen to them. Because between the cracks of uncertainty, we can find revelations we never knew were there. These phenomena mystify us. They excite us. They terrify us. They separate us. And they also bring us together. And ultimately, they do make us more human than we ever imagined. So please, keep staring upward and inward. Something will inevitably always find a way to stare back. I will be in the vendor room all of this week, so please come have a conversation with me. I would absolutely love to hear your stories. And let's make ufology whatever we want it to be. Thank you.